In the spring of 1939, a boy who had just started calling himself Stan Lee sat at a desk in a cramped office on 42nd Street in Manhattan, filling inkwells and sharpening pencils and fetching sandwiches for men who drew pictures of costumed heroes punching Nazi spies. He was 17 years old. The office belonged to Timely Comics, a pulp outfit owned by a man named Martin Goodman, who had noticed that characters in tights were selling, and the boy's job was to do whatever needed doing, run errands, proofread copy, sweep floors. His real name was Stanley Martin Lieber, and he had grown up poor in the Bronx during the Depression, the son of Romanian Jewish immigrants who had come to New York looking for something better and found mostly struggle. His father had worked sporadically as a dress cutter. His mother had kept the household together through sheer force of will. There had never been enough money, and Stanley had learned early that charm and hustle could sometimes substitute for what money could not buy. He was tall and thin, with dark wavy hair and a smile that came easily. He liked movies, he liked radio serials, he liked the idea of telling stories for a living, even if the stories were about men in red capes and women with impossible proportions. Comics were disposable entertainment, printed on cheap pulp paper and sold at newsstands for 10 cents, read by children and thrown away. They were not literature, they were not art, but they were work, and work was what you needed if you were 17 and trying to help your family get by. He used the name Stan Lee because he thought he might want to save his real name for something more respectable later, something serious, a novel maybe, though what that novel would be about he could not yet say. The office smelled of ink and cigarette smoke. There were always men hunched over drafting tables, penciling out panels, inking over the pencils, lettering dialogue into word balloons. The pace was relentless. Timely published dozens of titles, crime stories, westerns, funny animals, superhero books riding the wave that had started with Superman in '38 and kept building. The company was part of the thriving, chaotic industry that had sprung up almost overnight, feeding the hunger of a nation that wanted distraction from hard times and, increasingly, from the news coming out of Europe. Stanley absorbed it all. He watched how stories were structured, how panels led the eye, how a splash page could grab a reader's attention. He listened to the way the artists and writers talked, their shortcuts and their tricks, their frustrations with deadlines and page rates. Within months, he was writing. Small things at first, text fillers, the prose stories that publishers inserted into comic books to qualify for cheaper postal rates. Then backup stories, then covers for minor characters. He learned by doing, which was the only way to learn in a place like Timely. There were no schools for this, no courses, no textbooks. You wrote, you handed it in, it got printed or it got rewritten, and either way you wrote the next one. By 1941, when he was just 19 years old, he was named editor. The title meant less than it sounded. The two men who had been running the editorial side, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, had left abruptly after a dispute with Goodman, and Stanley was cheap, eager, and already there. He would hold the position, in one form or another, for the next 3 decades. The war came. In 1942, Stanley enlisted in the Army, though he did not see combat. He was assigned to the Signal Corps, writing training films and manuals and the occasional poster. He spent most of the war stateside, at bases in the South and the Midwest, doing work that was not so different from what he had been doing at Timely writing. To order, writing on deadline, writing things that would be used once and forgotten. He did not mind. He was good at it. He had a facility for dialogue, for pacing, for giving people what they wanted in a way that felt brisk and efficient and just a little bit charming. When he came back to New York in 1945, Timely was still there, still churning out comics, and his job was waiting for him. The next decade and a half were a long, strange drift through genres that rose and fell with the public's shifting moods. Superheroes, which had dominated the war years, faded badly once the war ended. Timely pivoted to westerns, to crime, to romance, to horror. Stanley wrote them all. He wrote under a dozen pseudonyms, Stan Lee most often, but also Neil Natz, Stan Lee backward, more or less, and others he would later forget. He wrote for titles like Young Romance and My Own Romance, stories of love triangles and heartbreak and girls who had to choose between the steady boy and the exciting one. He wrote for horror books like Journey into Mystery and Tales to Astonish, stories of ordinary people stumbling into the macabre, of monsters lurking in suburban basements, of cautionary tales that ended with twist endings borrowed from radio shows like The Twilight Zone. He wrote crime stories, westerns, humor, whatever Goodman thought would sell that month. He was fast, reliable, and professional. He showed up, he hit his deadlines, he did not complain. But he was also, by the mid-1950s, increasingly bored. He had been doing this for nearly 20 years. He was married now to a woman named Joan, an English war bride he had met in the 40s, a woman with a quick wit and a forthright manner who saw through his charm and loved him anyway. They had a daughter. He was in his 30s. And he was still writing fill-in stories for Monster Comics, still editing books that were read once and discarded, still working in a medium that no one took seriously. He thought about quitting. He thought about writing that novel, or trying television, or doing something, anything, that might feel less like treading water. There had been a scare in the early 50s that nearly destroyed the entire comics industry. A psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham had published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, arguing that comic books were corrupting America's youth, teaching them violence and deviance and immorality. The book had triggered Senate hearings, public outcry, and eventually the creation of the Comics Code Authority, a self-censorship body that imposed strict rules on what could and could not appear in comic books. No excessive violence. No sexual innuendo. No disrespect for authority. Crime could not be depicted sympathetically. Monsters had to be handled carefully. The code strangled creativity, but it kept the medium alive, barely. Publishers who did not adopt the code found their books pulled from newsstands. Timely adopted it. Everyone did, and Stan Lee kept writing, now within even tighter constraints. By 1961, he was thinking seriously about leaving. He was nearly 40. Timely had rebranded itself as Atlas Comics in the 50s, then as Marvel Comics at the start of the 60s, though the name did not change what they did or how they did it. Then Martin Goodman, who was Stan Lee's boss and also his wife's cousin, came to him with an idea. DC Comics, their biggest competitor, had recently had success reviving superheroes' new versions of old characters, updated for the modern era, packaged together in a book called Justice League of America. Goodman wanted Marvel to try the same thing. He wanted a team of superheroes. Stan Lee's response, at least in the version of the story he would tell for the rest of his life, was to talk to Joan. She told him that, if he was thinking of quitting anyway, he might as well write the kind of comic he wanted to write, the kind that interested him, without worrying about whether it fit the mold. And so he did. He sat down and he thought about what a superhero team might look like if the people in it were not perfect, not selfless, not even necessarily likable. What if they argued? What if they had egos? What if they had real problems, the kind that did not get solved by punching a villain? He called the book The Fantastic Four. He brought in Jack Kirby to draw it. Kirby was a legend by then, one of the most dynamic and imaginative artists in the business, a man who had co-created Captain America 20 years earlier and had been drawing comics almost as long as Stan Lee had been writing them. Together, they created a team of explorers who got caught in a cosmic raystorm and gained powers: a man who could stretch his body like rubber, a woman who could turn invisible, a hothead who could burst into flame, and a monster made of living rock. They were not a smooth, coordinated unit. They bickered. The hothead, Johnny Storm, clashed with the rock monster, Ben Grimm, who hated what he had become, who saw his transformation as a curse rather than a gift. The leader, Reed Richards, was obsessed with science to the point of neglecting his relationships. His girlfriend, Sue Storm, was often sidelined but gradually became the emotional center of the group. They lived in New York, in a building called the Baxter Building, and their problems were as much about paying rent and dealing with the press as they were about fighting Dr. Doom or the Mole Man. The book was different. It did not talk down to readers. It assumed they could follow ongoing storylines, complex characterizations, moral ambiguity. It was serialized in a way that most comics at the time were not. Each issue ended on a cliffhanger, with plot lines that carried over month to month, year to year, and it was written in a voice that felt conversational, even intimate. Stan Lee narrated in caption boxes, addressing the reader directly, calling them true believer or pilgrim, making them feel like insiders in a club that only the cool kids knew about. He gave the characters snappy, overlapping dialogue, the kind you might hear in a screwball comedy or a Hawksian film. It felt modern. It felt alive. The Fantastic Four was a success, and Stan Lee and Jack Kirby kept going. In 1962, they created the Hulk, a scientist named Bruce Banner, who turned into a giant green monster when he got angry, a creature of pure rage and pain, who could not control his transformations and was hunted by the military as a menace. They created Thor, the Norse god of thunder, trapped in the body of a lame doctor and forced to live among mortals. They created the X-Men, a team of teenage mutants born with strange powers, feared and hated by the very people they tried to protect, a transparent metaphor for anyone who had ever felt like an outsider. They created Iron Man, a billionaire arms dealer who built a suit of armor to keep his damaged heart beating, a man whose wealth and intelligence could not save him from his own vulnerability. They created Ant-Man and the Wasp, the Avengers, Black Panther, the first black superhero in mainstream comics. The ideas came fast, one after another, month after month, building a shared universe where all these characters existed in the same world, crossed paths, teamed up, clashed. And then, in the summer of 1962, Stan Lee sat down with an artist named Steve Ditko and created Spider-Man. Peter Parker was a high school student living in Queens with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben. He was a science nerd, a bookworm, bullied at school and ignored by girls. He got bitten by a radioactive spider during a class trip and gained powers the proportional strength of a spider, the ability to cling to walls, a precognitive spider sense that warned him of danger. He made himself a costume, red and blue with a webbed pattern, and started performing as a novelty act on television, trying to make money. And then one night after a performance, he let a thief run past him. He did not stop the man. It was not his problem. A few days later, that same thief killed his Uncle Ben during a robbery. Peter Parker learned, in that moment of devastating clarity, that with great power comes great responsibility. It was a line Stan Lee wrote, and it became the defining moral principle of the character, the weight Peter carried for the rest of his life. Spider-Man was different from every other superhero that had come before. He was not rich, like Batman or Iron Man. He was not a soldier like Captain America. He was not an alien like Superman. He was a kid from a working-class neighborhood who barely had enough money for rent and subway fare. He took photographs of himself as Spider-Man and sold them to a newspaper editor who hated Spider-Man just to pay bills. He missed dates because he was off fighting crime. He felt guilty constantly for not being there when his uncle was killed, for failing to save people, for every mistake he made. He was neurotic, self-doubting, perpetually unlucky. He was a hero, not because being a hero made his life better, but because he could not live with himself if he did not try. Steve Ditko's artwork gave the character a strange, kinetic energy. Ditko was not interested in the bombast and dynamism that Jack Kirby brought to his pages. His New York was cramped, shadowy, full of odd angles and unsettling compositions. His Spider-Man moved like a real spider, crouched and crawling, contorted in ways that did not look heroic so much as unnerving. Ditko's villains were grotesque and psychological: the Green Goblin, a cackling figure on a glider; Dr. Octopus, a scientist fused to mechanical tentacles. Mysterio, a special effects artist who used illusions to torment his enemies. The stories were as much about Peter Parker's internal struggles as they were about punching bad guys. The book felt personal, almost confessional, in a way that superhero comics had never felt before. Spider-Man became Marvel's biggest hit. Kids loved him because he was a kid. Teenagers loved him because he felt like them, powerless in all the ways that mattered, struggling with identity and responsibility and the gap between who you were and who you wanted to be. College students started reading Marvel comics, something that had never happened before, because the books felt smart, self-aware, willing to question their own premises. Stan Lee leaned into it. He started writing essays in the letter columns, talking directly to readers, fostering a sense of community. He came up with nicknames for the creative team himself: Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and others. He called himself Stan the Man, and referred to Marvel as the House of Ideas. He created a fan club called the Merry Marvel Marching Society. He wrote hype copy that was ironic enough to avoid feeling like hype, that winked at the reader while still insisting that what they were reading mattered. But the work itself came from collaboration, and the nature of that collaboration was complicated. Stan Lee worked in what came to be called the Marvel method. Instead of writing full scripts with panel-by-panel descriptions and dialogue, he would have a conversation with the artist, sometimes a long conversation, sometimes just a rough outline, and then the artist would go off and draw the entire story. Stan Lee would come back afterward and add dialogue and captions, shaping the narrative in the final pass. It was a fast, efficient way to produce comics, and it allowed artists like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko to have enormous creative input. Kirby was a storytelling genius, someone who thought in pictures and could construct entire mythologies from a few sentences of direction. Ditko was a visual auteur with a rigorous moral philosophy that bled into every page he drew. But when the books came out, Stan Lee's name was on every cover. Written by Stan Lee, the credits said, with the artist listed below. In interviews and public appearances, in the essays he wrote for Marvel's books, Stan Lee was the face and the voice of the company. He was gregarious, charming, articulate, comfortable in front of a microphone or a camera. Jack Kirby was gruff, working class, shy in public, more comfortable at his drafting table than on a stage. Steve Ditko was reclusive, deeply private, uninterested in self-promotion or celebrity. And so it was Stan Lee who became the public face of Marvel, Stan Lee who got interviewed, Stan Lee who was invited to speak at college campuses, and appeared on talk shows. He was good at it. He loved it. He had always been good at selling things, and what he sold, more than any individual comic, was the idea of Marvel, Marvel as a movement, Marvel as a worldview, Marvel as the underdog company that understood what readers wanted because they were not stuffy or corporate. They were just cool guys making cool books. The truth was messier. Jack Kirby and Stan Lee had been partners in the loosest sense for more than 2 decades by the time the Marvel Universe exploded in the 1960s. Kirby had co-created Captain America with Joe Simon in 1941. He had left timely, come back, left again, come back again. He and Stan Lee had worked together on romance comics and monster comics and westerns, a long, unglamorous grind through the 1950s. When the Fantastic Four happened, it was a collaboration, Stan Lee's instinct for character and dialogue, Kirby's visual imagination and sense of grandeur. But Kirby had also plotted most of those early stories. He had designed the characters, created the villains, invented much of the Marvel Universe's visual language. He did not write dialogue, but he told stories on the page in a way that was as much authorship as anything Stan Lee did. And yet, as Marvel's profile grew, the story that got told was that Stan Lee was the creative genius and Jack Kirby was the artist who drew Stan's ideas. It was not a story Stan Lee necessarily set out to tell, but it was one he did not correct. It was simpler that way. It fit the narrative that the press and the public wanted, one visionary leading a creative team. And Stanley, who had spent his whole life hustling, who had learned young that charm and self-promotion were survival skills, leaned into the role. He was the face of Marvel because someone had to be, and he was good at it in a way his collaborators were not. But by 1965, the cracks were showing. Steve Ditko, who'd been drawing Spider-Man since the character's creation, left Marvel abruptly. He and Stanley had stopped speaking to each other months earlier, communicating only through notes and intermediary staff. Ditko felt that he was not getting adequate credit for his role in creating Spider-Man and the other characters he had designed. He also had strong, idiosyncratic ideas about storytelling and morality, influenced by the philosophy of Ayn Rand, and those ideas increasingly clashed with the direction Stanley wanted to take the books. In the final issues Ditko drew, Peter Parker's college classmate Harry Osborn became more prominent, and a new character, Gwen Stacy, was introduced as a love interest. There was tension in the work, a sense of two creators pulling in different directions, and then Ditko was gone. He walked away from Spider-Man at the height of its popularity and never spoke about it publicly. Stanley continued writing the book with a new artist, John Romita, whose style was warmer and more romantic than Ditko's had been, and the book kept selling. But something had been lost. Jack Kirby stayed longer, but the same tensions were building. Kirby was Marvel's most prolific creator, drawing Fantastic Four, Thor, the Avengers, and other books simultaneously, working at a pace that was almost superhuman. He was turning out pages faster than anyone in the industry, filling them with cosmic landscapes and alien technology and mythological grandeur. The Fantastic Four visited other dimensions, fought world-ending threats, encountered gods and monsters. Thor's stories wove Norse mythology together with science fiction, creating a cosmology that felt ancient and modern at once. Kirby was building worlds, and Stanley was adding words, and together they made something extraordinary. But Kirby was not well compensated for it. He was paid by the page, a flat rate, with no royalties and no ownership stake in the characters he had co-created. This was standard practice in the comics industry at the time. Work for hire meant that the publisher owned everything. The artist and writer were just laborers, but Kirby had been doing this for 30 years, and he was tired. He was in his late 40s, his hands ached from the endless drawing, and he was watching Stan Lee get famous for work that Kirby felt was as much his as anyone's. In interviews, Stanley would talk about how he and Jack had created the Fantastic Four or the Hulk. But when pressed for details, the story Stanley told usually centered on his own contributions, his ideas for characterization, his dialogue, his vision. Kirby's role got compressed into Jack drew it, as if drawing were mere execution rather than creation. In 1970, Jack Kirby left Marvel and went to work for DC Comics, their biggest competitor. It was a blow. Kirby launched a series of ambitious projects at DC, including The New Gods, an epic space opera about warring pantheons of deities, a story that was weird and visionary and uncompromising. It did not sell well. Readers missed the Marvel Universe, the continuity and the familiar characters. Kirby's work at DC was too strange, too cerebral, too far outside the mainstream. Within a few years, he would return to Marvel. But the relationship was never the same. The glory days of collaboration were over. Stanley kept going. By the early 1970s, Marvel had become the dominant force in superhero comics, outselling DC for the first time in decades. The characters Stanley had co-created were everywhere: Spider-Man, the Hulk, the X-Men, Iron Man, Thor, Captain America. They appeared on lunchboxes and T-shirts and Saturday morning cartoons. There had been attempts to adapt them into live-action television, with limited success. A Spider-Man show, a Hulk show starring Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno, that became a surprise hit. Stanley was no longer writing as many comics. He had moved into a more executive role, overseeing editors, handling public relations, making appearances. He was Marvel's ambassador, its cheerleader, its spokesman. He traveled to colleges and gave speeches. He appeared on TV. He wrote a semi-regular column in Marvel's books, Stan's Soapbox, where he talked about tolerance and social justice and the need to judge people as individuals, themes that had always been present in the X-Men and other Marvel titles. He aged into the role. His hair went gray, then white. He wore tinted glasses and turtlenecks, a kind of hip uncle look that fit the persona he had cultivated, an elder statesman of a medium that was still not quite respectable, but was no longer disposable trash either. Comics were taken seriously now, at least in some circles. They were studied in college courses. They were reviewed in alternative newspapers. Marvel had proven that superhero stories could carry metaphor, could reflect the anxieties of the times: Vietnam, civil rights, Watergate, the generation gap. Stan Lee gave interviews where he talked about the social relevance of comics, how Spider-Man was about responsibility, how the X-Men were about prejudice, how the Fantastic Four were about family. He was good at articulating these themes, at making the work sound important. And the work was important, or at least it had become important to the people who had grown up reading it. But he also remained, always, a company man. Marvel was owned by a succession of corporations. It had been sold in the late 60s, then sold again, passed from one conglomerate to another like a small asset in a larger portfolio. Stan Lee's role was to keep the brand alive, to remind people that Marvel was special, that it had heart and personality and a connection to its readers. He did this even as the business became more ruthless, even as creators continued to be paid poorly, to have no ownership, to see their creations turned into merchandise and adaptations that made millions while they struggled to pay rent. Jack Kirby, in his later years, became increasingly vocal about what he saw as an injustice. He wanted credit, he wanted recognition, he wanted the characters he had co-created to be acknowledged as his as much as Stan Lee's or Marvel's. He gave interviews where he said that he had created the Marvel Universe, that Stan Lee had added dialogue, but that the ideas, the designs, the stories had come from him. Stan Lee's response was usually measured, diplomatic. He would say that he and Jack had worked together, that it was a collaboration, that they had both contributed. But he did not concede the point that Kirby wanted conceded, which was that Kirby had been the primary creative force and that history had given Stan Lee too much credit. Steve Ditko, true to form, said nothing publicly. He continued to work, drawing comics for small publishers, self-publishing odd, philosophical tracts about heroism and moral absolutes. He refused interviews, refused to attend conventions, refused to engage with the fame that Spider-Man had generated. He lived alone in a small apartment in Manhattan and worked until he died in 2018, his body not discovered for several days. The tension between Stan Lee and his collaborators became a central part of his legacy, a shadow that followed him even as he became more famous. In the 1980s and 90s, as the comics industry went through a boom driven by speculation and nostalgia, Marvel tried to turn its characters into movies and television shows, mostly without success. There were low-budget adaptations, direct-to-video releases, projects that never got off the ground. Stan Lee was involved in some of them, writing or consulting, though his influence on the actual execution was usually minimal. He moved to Los Angeles, tried his hand at developing television and film projects, most of which went nowhere. He had a brief, ill-fated attempt at running his own media company, Stan Lee Media, which collapsed in fraud and bankruptcy, though Stan Lee himself was not accused of wrongdoing. And then, in the 2000s, everything changed. Marvel, which had gone through bankruptcy in the 90s, rebuilt itself and began producing its own films. Iron Man, released in 2008 and directed by Jon Favreau, was a surprise hit, funny and smart and visually inventive, with Robert Downey Jr. delivering a performance that captured both the arrogance and the vulnerability of Tony Stark. It was followed by The Incredible Hulk, then Iron Man 2, then Thor, then Captain America, and then, in 2012, The Avengers, a film that brought all of Marvel's heroes together in a single story and became one of the highest-grossing films of all time. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, as it came to be called, was built on the characters Stanley had co-created 50 years earlier. Over the next decade, it would grow into the most successful film franchise in history, generating billions of dollars and becoming a dominant force in global pop culture. Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Avengers, Black Panther characters who had started as cheap entertainment for kids were now the center of a vast multimedia empire, and Stanley lived to see it. He appeared in every Marvel film as a cameo, a running gag that fans looked forward to, a moment where the old man who had started it all would show up on screen, usually delivering a single line or making a brief, humorous appearance. He loved it. He was in his 80s, then his 90s, white-haired and bespectacled and moving slowly, but he showed up, he smiled, he waved at crowds at Comic-Con and premiere events. He had become a beloved figure, Uncle Stan, the man who had made all of this possible, but the question of credit never went away. Jack Kirby had died in 1994, still bitter, still fighting with Marvel over the return of his original artwork and the acknowledgement of his contributions. His family continued the fight, eventually reaching a settlement with Marvel in 2014 that gave them an undisclosed financial agreement and a credit on the films as co-creator of the characters. Steve Ditko died in 2018, months before Stanley, never having reconciled or spoken publicly about his grievances. And Stanley, when asked about it in interviews, would say that yes, Jack and Steve had been instrumental, that they had been partners, that he could not have done it without them. But he also maintained that he had been the driving creative force, the one who had understood what readers wanted, the one who had given the characters their humanity. He was charming when he said it, self-deprecating even, but he did not yield the ground. The question of who created what and who deserves credit is complicated in any collaborative medium, but it is especially complicated in comics, where the division of labor is clear, but the division of authorship is not. A writer provides the words, but in a visual medium, the pictures tell as much or more of the story. A character's design, their body language, the way they move across a page, these are acts of creation as surely as any line of dialogue. Stanley understood story structure and character psychology. He knew how to write banter, how to give heroes vulnerabilities, how to make readers care. But Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko visualized those characters, gave them form, built the worlds they inhabited, and often plotted the stories they appeared in. To say that Stan Lee created Spider-Man is true, but incomplete. To say that Steve Ditko created Spider-Man is also true, but incomplete. They created him together in a collaboration that was intense and fruitful and ultimately unequal, because Stanley was the one who got famous and Ditko was the one who walked away. This is the central tension of Stanley's life and work, and it does not resolve cleanly. He was a writer who became the face of a creative movement he did not create alone. He was a showman who understood the value of narrative, both in the stories he told and in the story he told about himself. He was someone who worked in a medium that was made by many hands but celebrated as if it were the product of individual genius, and he benefited from that misunderstanding more than anyone else. And yet he was also genuinely a gifted storyteller. The dialogue he wrote was snappy and human. The characters he helped create were deeper and more complex than anything that had come before in superhero comics. He understood what made people care about a character, what made them come back month after month. He turned the superhero genre into something that could carry emotional weight, that could reflect real anxieties and real longing. He was both the genius the public thought he was, and the credit taker his collaborators accused him of being. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. By the time Stanley reached old age, he had become a kind of mascot, a figurehead for an entertainment empire that had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined when he was filling inkwells on 42nd Street. He lived in a large house in the Hollywood Hills. His wife Joan, who had been with him since the 1940s, died in 2017, and he was devastated. They had been married for nearly 70 years. In the last year of his life, there were troubling reports. legal disputes over his care, accusations that people around him were taking advantage of his age and his wealth, elder abuse allegations that played out in the press. It was ugly and sad, the kind of ending that no one wanted for someone who had given so much joy to so many people. He died in November of 2018, at the age of 95. The tributes were immediate and overwhelming. Actors who had played his characters posted messages on social media. Fans shared memories of reading his comics as kids, of meeting him at conventions, of the cameos that had become a beloved ritual. There were retrospectives in major newspapers, segments on the evening news, think pieces about his legacy and his impact on popular culture. The Walt Disney Company, which by then owned Marvel, issued a statement calling him a superhero in his own right. His funeral was private, but the public mourning went on for weeks. What he left behind was a body of work that had become the foundation of a mythology. The characters he helped create, Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Thor, Black Panther, the Hulk, had become as central to American popular culture as any characters created in the 20th century. They were more recognizable than most literary figures, more enduring than most film icons. Children played with their action figures. Adults watched their movies. They appeared on lunchboxes and billboards and theme park rides. They have been translated into dozens of languages, adapted into countless formats, absorbed into the global imagination. But the work itself, the original comics, had a different kind of power. If you go back and read the early issues of The Amazing Spider-Man, drawn by Steve Ditko and written by Stan Lee, you find something that still feels vital. The panels are crowded, the pacing is fast, the plotting is sometimes clumsy, but the emotional core is there. Peter Parker swings through the city at night, alone, narrating his thoughts in caption boxes, worrying about Aunt May's health, about money, about whether the girl he likes will ever see him as anything other than a nerd. He fights the Green Goblin or Dr. Octopus, but the real fight is internal guilt, responsibility, the fear that he is not enough. The suit gives him power, but it does not make him confident. It just makes him a target. There is something in that, in the idea of a hero who is perpetually overwhelmed, that spoke to readers in 1963 and still speaks to readers now. Or, take the X-Men, co-created with Jack Kirby. The original 1963 series was not initially a huge success, but the concept was potent. Teenagers born with mutations that gave them powers but also made them outcasts, hated and feared by a world that did not understand them. Professor Xavier, the team's mentor, preached tolerance and coexistence. Magneto, the villain, believed that humans and mutants could never live together peacefully, that mutants had to dominate or be destroyed. It was a conflict with no easy answers, a metaphor for racism, for homophobia, for any kind of difference that made people uncomfortable. Stanley said in interviews that he had not set out to write a story about civil rights, but that the metaphor was there once readers pointed it out, and he embraced it. The X-Men became, over time, Marvel's most important franchise, especially after a relaunch in the 1970s brought in new characters and deeper, more explicitly political storylines. But the seed of it, the idea that the outsider could be powerful and still not accept it, was there from the beginning. The Fantastic Four, the book that started it all, remains perhaps the purest expression of what Stanley and Jack Kirby were trying to do. It is a family, not a team. Reed Richards and Sue Storm are husband and wife. Johnny Storm is Sue's younger brother. Ben Grimm is Reed's best friend, transformed into a monster and unable to return to his human form. They love each other, but they also drive each other crazy. They argue about money, about strategy, about who forgot to pick up groceries. Reed is a genius, but he is also absent-minded, obsessed with his work to the point of neglecting Sue. Sue is patient, but she is also frustrated, tired of being taken for granted. Johnny is cocky and reckless. Ben is angry and sad and uses humor to cover the pain of what he has lost. They are complicated, and their complications make them real. and the villain's Doctor Doom, the ruler of a fictional Eastern European nation, a man in a metal mask whose genius rivals Reed's but whose arrogance and pain have twisted him into a tyrant. Galactus, a cosmic being who devours planets to sustain himself, utterly indifferent to the lives of the beings who live on those worlds. The Skrulls, shape-shifting aliens, the Inhumans, a hidden race of superpowered beings living in isolation. Kirby visualized these threats on a scale that was epic and strange, filling pages with cosmic machinery and alien landscapes and energy bursts that looked like the universe tearing itself apart. Stan Lee grounded it in human emotion, in the fear and determination of people trying to protect their world. Together, they created something that was operatic and intimate at the same time. The Marvel Universe as it developed through the 1960s was revolutionary not because it was more violent or more realistic than what had come before, but because it was more human. The heroes had flaws, they made mistakes, they failed. They faced consequences. Spider-Man could not save everyone. The Hulk hurt people he cared about. Iron Man's technology sometimes made things worse. The X-Men could not make people stop hating them just by being heroic. The books acknowledged that power did not solve problems, it just created new ones, and that felt true in a way that older superhero comics had not. It also reflected the anxieties of the era. The 1960s were a time of enormous social upheaval, civil rights, Vietnam, the counterculture, the generation gap. Stan Lee's characters existed in that world. They worried about war, about prejudice, about authority. They questioned themselves, questioned each other. They were not perfect emblems of American virtue like Superman or Captain America had been in earlier decades. They were flawed, conflicted, struggling. And that made them modern. It made them feel like they mattered. But Stan Lee did not do it alone. He could not have done it alone. Jack Kirby brought the visual imagination, the sense of scale, the ability to make the fantastic feel real. Steve Ditko brought the psychological depth, the moral complexity, the sense of a world that was dangerous and strange. Artists like John Romita, John Buscema, Gene Colan, and many others contributed their own visions, their own storytelling instincts. Writers like Roy Thomas, Denny O'Neil, and others expanded the Marvel Universe in new directions once Stan Lee stepped back from writing individual books. The Marvel method, for all its flaws, created space for collaboration, for artists to shape stories in ways that would not have been possible under a traditional, writer-driven model. But Stan Lee was the connective tissue. He wrote the dialogue for all of those books, month after month, for years. He shaped the tone, the voice, the personality of the Marvel Universe. He was the one who made it feel like these characters knew each other, that they inhabited the same world. He was the one who talked directly to readers, who made them feel like part of a community. He understood branding before it was called branding, understood that the story you told about the work was as important as the work itself. He turned Marvel into a movement, and movements need leaders. And so the question remains, without a clean answer. Who created the Marvel Universe? Stan Lee did with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and many others. Who deserves credit? All of them. Who got credit? Mostly Stan Lee. Is that fair? No. Is it his fault? Partly. Did the work matter? Yes. Does the unfairness of the credit diminish the work? No. Does it complicate how we think about Stan Lee's legacy? Absolutely. In the years after his death, as the Marvel Cinematic Universe continued to expand, there were debates online and in print about whether Stan Lee had been a creator or a con artist, a genius or a glorified editor, a collaborator or a thief. The answer inevitably is that he was several of those things at once, depending on the day, the project, the collaborator. He was someone who worked in a system that exploited artists and writers, and he benefited from that system more than most. He was also someone who genuinely loved the work, who cared about the characters, who wanted to tell stories that mattered. He was ambitious and insecure, generous and self-promoting, humble in some moments and insufferable in others. He was a hustler from the Bronx who stumbled into a job at 17 and turned it into a 60-year career. He was a showman who understood that the story you told about yourself could be as important as any story you put on the page. There is a moment in one of the early issues of The Amazing Spider-Man, drawn by Steve Ditko and written by Stan Lee, where Peter Parker is walking home after a long night of fighting crime. He is exhausted, his costume torn, his body aching. He thinks about how no one knows who he is, how he does not get credit or thanks, how people hate Spider-Man even though he tries to help. He thinks about how much easier it would be to quit, to walk away, to let someone else deal with it. And then he does not quit. He keeps going. Because he has to. Because no one else will. Because responsibility is not something you choose. It is something that chooses you. That was the core of what Stan Lee and his collaborators created. The idea that heroism is not about glory or recognition. It is about showing up and doing the work even when it is hard, even when it hurts, even when no one sees. Peter Parker understood that. The X-Men understood that. The Fantastic Four understood that. It was a lesson that resonated with millions of readers, across generations, across borders. And it was a lesson that Stan Lee himself struggled with, because he wanted the recognition, needed it in a way that his collaborators perhaps did not, or at least said they did not. He wanted to be seen, to be celebrated, to be remembered. And he is, but the work endures in a way that is bigger than him, bigger than any one person. The characters have outlived their creators. They have been reinterpreted, reimagined, adapted, transformed. Writers and artists who were not born when Spider-Man first appeared have told stories about him. Actors who grew up reading X-Men comics have played those characters on screen. The mythology that Stan Lee helped create is no longer his. It belongs to the culture now, to the people who grew up with it, and the people who are still discovering it. And that, perhaps, is the only resolution. The work matters. The question of who deserves credit is important, because fairness is important, because acknowledgement is important, because Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and all the others who built the Marvel Universe deserve to be remembered and honored. But the work itself is larger than the question of credit. The work is what people return to, what they carry with them, what shapes their imagination and their understanding of heroism and responsibility, and what it means to be different, to be powerful, to be afraid, and to keep going anyway. Stan Lee spent his last years surrounded by the evidence of his success movies, merchandise, fame. He also spent them surrounded by the evidence of his failure to fully acknowledge the people who had made that success possible. Both truths sit alongside each other, unresolved, because they cannot be resolved. We live in a culture that wants individual geniuses, single authors, clear lines of credit. Collaborative art resists that. It is messy. It is full of overlapping contributions, ideas that emerge from conversation, work that builds on work. The Marvel Universe is a cathedral built by many hands, and Stan Lee was one of the builders, and also the one who stood at the door and welcomed people in, and also the one who, when asked, said, "I built this," when the truth was more complicated. He was a writer. He was a salesman. He was a storyteller who understood character and dialogue and the importance of making people care. He was a collaborator who took more credit than he gave. He was a visionary who saw that superheroes could be more than power fantasies, that they could be mirrors for the anxieties and hopes of the people who read about them. He was a company man who protected the interests of the corporation even when it hurt the people he worked with. He was charming and infuriating, generous and selfish, beloved and resented. He was, in other words, human, complicated, flawed, powerful but not accepted even by his own collaborators, responsible for something extraordinary and also responsible for the pain of not sharing that responsibility more equitably. The Marvel Universe is his monument and his accusation. It is the thing he will be remembered for, and the thing that reminds us he did not do it alone. Walk into any theater showing a Marvel film, and you will see his face, briefly, in a cameo that lasts a few seconds. Stay through the credits, and you will see his name, and Jack Kirby's, and Steve Ditko's, and dozens of others. The credits keep rolling. The story keeps going. The work is bigger than any one person, and it endures.